All right, Tim, it's so good to meet you. Where am I finding you today?
I'm at our global headquarters in Seattle.
Fantastic. I'd love to start from the beginning if it's okay with you.
Sure.
I'm curious, what did your parents do for a living and how did that maybe impact some of the life and career decisions you've made?
Oh, interesting. My dad was a small business owner. He was an optician and owned a retail store in St. Louis, Missouri. My mom stayed at home. So, um, but yeah, but they were, we had six kids in my family growing up. And it was, yeah, I would say though, if you're asking about how my parents' choices affected my decision making, you know, very interested in my dad who sold people eyewear said to me when I was a teenager, he said, "Hey, as you think about your life and career, you should definitely focus on selling people things they want, not things they need, because people will pay a lot of money for things they want, and they want to pay the least amount of money possible for the things they need." And I've always found that to be somewhat wise.
Did he
Um,
did he say that because like he was selling eyewear and it was more of a necessity?
It was, yeah, I think so. I mean, essentially, people want to pay as little as possible for healthcare services, right? So they can spend money on a vacation or a new car or their house or whatever it is. And I
Yeah,
think he kind of figured that out pretty early on. So
that's
anyway,
funny.
I've been living in the world of selling people things that they want for my whole life.
Yeah. Where were you in the sort of were you like the oldest, youngest kid?
Second oldest, I was the oldest boy. They called us the Bantle bunch. There were three boys and three girls, every other, and I
Wow.
was number two. Yeah.
That must have been pretty amazing. I feel like you never a dull moment. And I have three sisters, but I can only imagine six.
Yeah, I mean, growing up in St. Louis too, all our most of our family was there. So I had cousins in virtually every class in our grade school growing up, right? So it was just a different time.
I noticed you've worked at a number of companies, and I imagine you've been around many great leaders. Some we've heard of, some we may not even know. And I'm curious, when you think about competencies of the best leaders, if there's two or three of them, what comes to mind?
I tend to think leaders almost are by definition smart people in a holistic sense, right? I mean, you need to be able to understand the situation you're in and help problem solve and lead people towards an outcome or a solution. So I tend, if I were to just canvas, leaders I've known, they come in all shapes and sizes, in different backgrounds, um, but they're almost all very smart people, kind of holistically. I mean, the other thing, has got to be integrity. When you're working with people and leading people, you need to have a sort of moral compass that people can rely on. And I find that to be super important.
I love that. I've heard you talk about like critical thinking and maybe even your educational background contributing to that. Do you still think about that?
Oh, for sure. I mean, when I went through school, I studied philosophy and literature, and everyone just wanted to know if I was going to be an attorney, and I wasn't sure what I was going to be. I thought I was going to be a professor, candidly, and I started working in a gear shop in college, and for the rest of my life, I've worked in the outdoor industry. And this is probably one of those things I can reference my dad, but I guess maybe 10 years into my career, having six kids and being in a big family, people would always and he would see people all the time in his office. They would always seek out advice. And he started to joke when people would ask what they thought he should study at school or they should study at school, he'd say, "I just think philosophy at this point. You should just which he was totally dumb as a small business owner. I mean, I laugh about this, but as a small business owner with six kids, my sister went to school ahead of me. I think we were the first two in our family to go to college. My sister went to school ahead of me and she went to art school. And then I went to study philosophy. And I think he was sitting there scratching his head, going like, what did I do wrong? How did, how did this go this way? And my sister turned out to be a CMO of a Fortune 50 company. And I've been working in the outdoor space in a variety of leadership roles ever since. So it worked out, but it was not obvious at the outset.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you mentioned, being intelligent, having integrity and a moral compass, maybe being a good critical thinker. Who are some of the people that come to mind when you think about it? It could be people you worked with, or even maybe people you admire. But who comes to mind as some of the leaders that maybe encompass those traits? I was thinking of the founder of Patagonia, that like one person that probably comes to mind. But I'm wondering. Maybe him or anyone else.
Yeah, Ivan was really interesting as a person because I don't think he would even consider himself a leader. Like he was never someone who wanted to be in the spotlight, to be the focus, to be considered in charge. He liked, he had a famous saying that he didn't hire MBAs, but his management philosophy was to manage by absence, right? And
Tell me
so
about that.
his goal was to kind of come into a situation and say, "Hey, I think we should go this way, you guys figure it out and tell us how we should do it." And so he was very, very good at setting the high level direction for the business and much less interested in managing the day-to-day activities. And so I think when you look at the success of the brand over the years, I think I can comfortably say that virtually all of the high level ideas kind of came from Yvon, right? And the company rallied around those over time. So he was very good at setting a North Star. He had a lot of integrity as a person. Um, but it was very interesting. I think he had a very ambivalent relationship with leadership or formal hierarchy and structure that way.
It's almost like the opposite of Steve Jobs, but you still get to the same destination.
Um, yeah, that might be the case. I think they're different in a lot of ways. I mean, Ivan was really a craftsman, um, not a technologist, and I think that you can see that in those two businesses, even though they both are very iconic with kind of luminary founders.
I love it. What's the best piece of career advice you ever got?
I'll go back to actually this is a high school teacher I had, and he basically taught a senior level course on like life decision making, and his the entire thesis of the course was follow your bliss using the kind of Bill Moyer's or hero's journey sort of framework. And the thesis was the things that you are the most passionate about and the most deeply interested in, you'll be the most successful in. And while, you know, some people may disagree with that, I've been lucky enough to literally do that and it's worked, right? And so I think I can kind of go back to those formative years, leaving high school, going to university and saying that I've somehow been able to follow my bliss and it's turned into a career over that time.
I read that some of those early jobs, maybe after high school or after college, was it teaching skiing and rock climbing?
Yeah. Yeah. I spent a semester with the National Outdoor Leadership School during college. It was my last semester of college. And NOLS is how it's referred to, was created to train outward bound instructors. So its entire kind of mission is developing outdoor leadership. And after school, I went to work. I thought I'd go to graduate school, and in turn, actually went to live on a ranch in Wyoming and teach kids mountaineering and climbing and kayaking and backcountry skiing and snowboarding.
I always feel like there's some gems and lessons from the jobs that we have. Might not be glamorous, but early on, it sounds like there probably were some great lessons. I mean, my jobs were much easier probably than what you were doing. Do you feel the same? Like some of those early jobs gave you a foundation in terms of leadership and communication and things like that?
Oh, for sure. But maybe the most important things that your early jobs give you is a building sense of character because you have to suffer a lot. I mean, it's no matter,
Yeah.
what end of the spectrum you are in your career, whether you're a physician on one end of the spectrum or work in the outdoor industry on the other end of the spectrum, you're basically going to spend the first 10 years, out of school, um, just grinding, working really long days, 6 days a week, 7 days a week, low pay, and putting in that time is super important, uh, just in terms of learning. But also, I think there's a lot of character development that comes from that.
There's this saying like, your reputation precedes you. And I heard you say that almost every job you've gotten was because maybe the impact you left previously and someone put you on a short list. Someone mentioned you for a job. What do you tell young people in terms of your reputation?
I've had a number of jobs over the years, but I don't have a CV, and it's because if you would have told me at any point over the last 20 years what I'd be doing 18 months in the future, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have said, that's very unlikely. But all of those opportunities are genuinely a function of a network of people that who you've worked for, Um, and they get phone calls, and those phone calls are like, "Hey, I'm looking for somebody to do X." And if you're the person that they think of when that occurs, you get the phone call. And you know, I'd say almost every job I've had has been a function of that dynamic.
That's awesome. Um, it seems like you've lived in a lot of places. If I'm just looking at your LinkedIn profile, um, what has that been like? Because I feel like some people, think about moving even once and uprooting yourself, maybe your family. If someone has kids, it could be really
Yeah.
difficult. But what have you learned about? And I think maybe one of your superpowers is the ability to adapt. So I'm curious, what have you learned about just sort of this, constant move and adaptation to different places? What has that taught you?
Well, I think to some degree, I'm a little bit like genetically predisposed to being comfortable with uncertainty and change. But the the real interesting thing, the kind of the subplot, if you that you can't really see on a LinkedIn profile, is my wife and I grew up in Patagonia together. We were working there. We met and fell in love there. We had our first son working there, and he had massive special needs, and she had to pull the ripcord on her career. And we kind of were standing there looking at each other, going, "Okay, well, what now? How's this going to work?" I got a phone call for a job that was starting an apparel division with Black Diamond Equipment, which is sort of uh, the what Chouinard Equipment became after Yvon closed it to focus on Patagonia. And and my career has, that experience of having a special needs kid and having to have your wife withdraw from the workforce, it looked like a crisis at the time. It looked like, oh, this is a tragedy. You've got to, depart a career that you've been working on for 10 years, and stay home with a kid that's having a lot of trouble. But in the end, when you look back at it, it really was an opportunity because Sarah couldn't work, I was free to go wherever the job opportunities were. And so moving from California to Utah, Utah to Europe, Europe back to the US, to Canada, and traveling a lot along the way. So, in retrospect, this thing that was a kind of fundamental crisis for our family was also the origin of the opportunity, because we weren't saying, well, what can we do to stay put forever? It was, what can we do to support the family with a special needs kid so that mom can be home? And it freed us up to just move around as a small family unit. And that has actually been, I don't know if that it's a personal superpower, it's an adaptation to the world that as you experience it. Um, but each of the jobs have been, just a reflection of going where the opportunity was at the time and being free to do that.
Wow, interesting. It's not to quote Steve Jobs, but like it's so hard to connect the dots, right? Until you look back.
Yeah,
It's
totally.
really fascinating. Um, I don't want to overlook your experience mountain climbing. I've never done it. What can we learn about the focus that it takes in that sport, in terms of maybe relating that to other areas of our lives?
I think people are happiest when they're in a state where they have to be very focused on what they're doing. I think whether it be climbing mountains, doing intense physical activity, doing creative pursuits, focusing on a massive spreadsheet out to double Z, I mean, whatever it is that makes you, kind of fires you up. I think people just naturally seek out these states where they can be fully immersed in the environment they're in and the problems they're trying to solve. And, climbing is just a very extreme example of that, but it's not unlike virtually anything.
What attracted you to Filson?
Filson's a super interesting brand, because it goes back to 1897. So it's literally like one of the oldest apparel companies in the United States today. And it was founded literally during the gold rush in the late 1800s uh, to basically outfit people to go to Alaska. And the business has never scaled. So it's this gem of a business. I mean, I'm sitting here in our corporate headquarters. We manufacture on the ground floor here products that were originally patented in 1914. We've got supplier relationships with, mills that we've been buying fabric from for over 100 years, which is just unheard of in today's market. Um, and there's just something extremely unique about the kind of essence of the brand, that very, very few people know about. It's interesting when I reflect back on my experience in Patagonia. I started working at Patagonia, it was a couple $100 million, and I'd be at a hotel and the people checking me in or checking me out couldn't pronounce the word Patagonia, right? They would kind of look at it and they would kind of stumble through it, and then I would tell them. And by the time I left Patagonia, and it's more like $1 billion business at that time, everybody could say the word Patagonia. Everybody knew what it was, and so seeing Filson, having this incredible pedigree, this great history, a beautiful product, and like a deep sense of quality, and then realizing that it's never really been exposed to a much larger audience, and what's possible there was, I think, the most intriguing thing about joining the business.
Interesting. So it sounds like, if I'm hearing you, you've had a lot of different experiences, large companies, small companies. This is a unique, I'm sure every situation is unique, but it's almost
Yeah.
like you haven't seen this situation exactly. And there's a lot of upside just in terms of the heritage of the company.
Yeah, when you try to compare Filson to other brands in the market, it's very difficult to find good one-for-one relationships or comparisons. And so it is a discrete and unique opportunity. Um, but there is this long history of great global brands coming from the Western United States, and I actually think that that's a function of geography and culture. But there are a lot of qualities that West Coast American brands have, ranging all the way up and down the coast, um, that really resonate globally. And when you sit on the West Coast of the U.S., you're kind of equidistant to Europe and to Asia, right? And so I don't think it's an accident that a lot of
Mm.
great global brands come from this geography. And ultimately, we just want to make sure that the business is kind of the best version of itself, expressing those ideas.
What advice would you give a new CEO or president of a company in the first 6 months? What would you say are the two or three things that you've got to really focus and do as I'm sure you're still absorbing and listening and probably taking action at this point, but like, what advice would you impart on somebody that's new, overseeing a company?
You got to ask a lot of questions. I think, you know, I'm sure that my team is just tired of me asking questions, but I basically will spend 6 months continually asking questions. I've seen in my career, as I can remember being a young guy, working at a few of the brands that I grew up in, and seeing senior executives come in from other businesses. And, um, it very common in the outdoor space to be like, "Hey, we hired a Nike executive to come into outdoor," and they show up with the Nike playbook and the Nike perspective on culture and the Nike perspective on operations, and you just say, "Hey, this is a Nike." It's totally it. There are some similarities, but there's as much different about these businesses and their opportunities as there is similarities. And so I've always been very reluctant to take a playbook from the old shop, so to speak, and apply it at the new one. I really like to work on businesses kind of on their own terms, because although a lot of these brands kind of look similar from the outside, given where they are in their life cycle as a brand, where they are in the business cycle, where they are in their own development, the opportunities and all of the structure and models for how to run the business, kind of need to be tuned for where it is today. And so, you know, when I join a business like joining Filson, my first and kind of primary goal is to just truly understand how the thing works today, as we start to figure out where to go.
Do you think it's an advantage, having the experience that you have, like working from the ground up within these companies, having experience in sales and product versus parachuting in from, like a big four consulting company?
You'd be surprised how many people from big four consulting companies have asked me, how can I get the job like yours? And I said, well, I don't know, go back and start out in retail when you're 18 years old. But or spend about, 5 years living in a tent, 150 days a year. The, it's totally different. And
Like, the nuances of the problem. I imagine you know the nuances of the problems that people have in many different sports.
Sure. And I think the in some ways the more interesting thing is the nuances of the business itself and how you apply that to, you know, you know, I kind of think working in the apparel business is as much anthropology as anything, right? And so, it's really about observing people, culture, the activities that they do, and then, kind of marrying product up to that. And while there are now university degrees that you can get in like outdoor product management or things like that, they're relatively new. When I was in school, I had no idea the types of jobs I've had even existed. And I always find that kind of funny, that it's like I was like, wow, you can do this for work. This is great.
Yeah, that's funny. What would you say is your proudest career accomplishment so far?
I would say there's two things I'm probably the most proud of. One is my family, you know, to kind of get to where I am in life and have a loving relationship and a solid relationship with your kids and with my wife is by far the most important thing in my life. So that's, but I kind of see that as almost like a precondition for being good at work. So it's
Yeah.
like, that's like the substrate level of your life. And that is, for everything that we've been through as a family is a heck of an accomplishment.
How
And
old are the
then
kids now?
14 and 11.
Wow. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. And they've lived all over the world and had to go to school and speak German and French and all
Wow.
kinds of kind of interesting things as they've moved around. So they don't remember most of it, unfortunately. The kids, funny thing about kids, you think, oh, do you remember what this and that? And they're like, I don't recall that at all. So but I do think the family is really sort of come top of mind. And then kind of going through the kind of hyper growth stage at Patagonia when I was there, I think just was super gratifying. When I joined the company, in some ways, Ivan had kind of given up on the outdoor market. He was wanted to be in surfing and food. He's just like, this outdoor thing is just too competitive, and there's not a path there. And I can remember going to my first board meeting and saying, "No, Ivan, I think you've got like a $200 million business here that could be like a $2 billion business. Like we have to do is show up with product that the consumer, that people want." And the product portfolio was just really disconnected from the marketplace at that time. And I remember him looking at me and going, it's just really hard to take market share from people. It's never going to happen. Well, that's all Patagonia's done for the last, 15 years is just peel away market share in the specialty market globally. And that's really a function of the brand being really solid and being exactly what you would expect it to be, and bringing the product portfolio along so that people had high quality, interesting things to buy. And you can take a business that's quite small and make it quite big with that simple math.
When you were there, were people willing to spend $80 on a t-shirt just to have the name across their chest? Or was it there yet? Because I feel like it is, people just want to wear anything made by
Yeah.
them.
You know, the real breakthrough that we had there, of course, part of the success of the brand was just being ahead of its time from a sustainability perspective, and then growing into that as a company. But we had a number of breakthroughs in the product world. The down sweater collection, which kind of reinvented down jackets and skinny down jackets, or created the category. The Nano Puff collection, which kind of reinvented or invented a whole new way of dressing in synthetic insulation, and the Black Hole series, and all of those businesses that we created at that time just sort of became annuities for the brand. Because they just become a base part of the total product portfolio and the global revenue, and they kind of really enable the rest of the business to be what it is. Because what you'll find with apparel companies is, by and large, something like 10 products drive most of the revenue, right? And you just got to work really hard to find those. And so again, just to come back to the question, like something you're proud of is like sort of helping Patagonia be successful business, not just a great brand, I think would be the thing I was the most proud of there.
If we kind of double click on that for a second, would you say the Nano Puff launch was something that you're really proud of, just in terms of like a product accomplishment?
For sure. I can remember, if you've ever had to trademark a product, it, your attorney looks at you and goes, "Oh, come on, do we really need to do this?" Well, I was trying to get the Nano Puff trademarked, and at the time, Apple had the iPod Nano, right? And we had a product called the Micro Puff, the Patagonia Micro Puff, and I was like, "Well, we're making like a super light version of the Micro Puff. it needs to be called the Nano. And they're like, oh, we can't get it. Well, it turns out there was an open registration, or the ability to register for apparel and outerwear and jackets. And our legal counsel went out and basically trademarked every possible combination of Nano Puff that he could get his hands on. And then the Patagonia Nano outlasted the Apple Nano. Like the Apple Nano doesn't exist anymore, but they were born right around the same time.
That's interesting. I mean, that's become a jacket that's like, people, I'm sure it's initially designed, I was talking to some guys at Mountain Hardware and they said, well, they're probably, I don't know if that jacket came after the Nano Puff, but that jacket was designed to actually be like a layer underneath a shell when you're out in the elements. But like the Nano Puff has become also the business people just want to wear one just because I feel like it's just expanded into sort of the commonplace from this idea.
Well, I mean, the origins of that product are interesting because we were, Patagonia started with fleece and almost invented fleece, right? I mean, it literally, like, Melinda found like toilet seat and bath mat material and made the first fleece jackets out of it. Like if you think of those big fluffy
Yeah.
fleece jackets, right? Like there was like a new category. And while I was there, we were kind of banging our heads on the wall saying, hey, this fleece category needs reinvention. It needs, it needs to, we need to grow. We need new ideas here. And, believe it or not, and this actually precedes the Nano, but it's a nice tie-in. We had a great industrial designer who led our technical product line design. And he came in one day and he's like, listen, I know how fleece is made. I just can't think of any new concepts in fleece, but I've been thinking about this new concept in down. And he said, most down jackets, the channels on them are like this thick. And so when they're this thick, you have to put this much down in them to keep them full. He said, but if you just cut the channel in half, you can put half as much down in it. And you cut it in half again, you can put another half as much down in it. And so he built some prototypes that basically shrunk the down jacket from a big puffy, mountaineering coat down to something that's light, like a sweater. And that was kind of the origin of the down sweater concept. Was really, I mean, at its very beginning, we were trying to figure out a solution to fleece. But the answer was totally different than what we thought at the outset. So we thought we were working on a fleece project. It turns out we were reinventing down insulation. Um, and the Nano Puff was simply a matter of going like, okay, we've already proved this concept in down. How do we do this in synthetic? And launched from there. But the reason people like wearing that product is because it's so light and traps heat close to your body. In that way, it's, it can be both an interior layer and an outer layer. But I digress here. I could spend
Yeah.
all day talking about product.
Well, so I mean, I think this is a good segue. Like, how do you think about, like, how do you know it's going to be successful, right? When like maybe it was the iPhone, but like when certain, the Shuffle or the Nano, when certain products come out, you just never know. And I used to work at BlackBerry a long time ago, and we had products that I can't say, yeah, a lot didn't in the end.
Yeah.
But did you ever think like, what if we come out with this thing and it's like a complete flop? Or how did you assess the risk of something new that you really, I mean, maybe, within the four walls because everyone likes it at the company, but like, what if you launch this thing and it goes to, the REIs of the world and nobody buys it?
Yeah. Well, that happens every day in our space, right? Really unique and novel ideas don't get traction. And so you run that risk every time you create something new. In the case of the Nano Puff, we kind of knew right away. Like it was one of those situations where, if you launch it, the first round of reception is your internal sales launch with your sales teams. It was like,
Oh, you
run.
just knew.
You take it
Okay.
out, to retailers. Retailers, all of a sudden your orders come in much bigger than your forecast. And then you start selling it and it starts selling faster than you planned. And so you're just in chase mode. And
Wow.
that doesn't happen every day. But it's really nice when it does.
I asked this former NFL GM, I said, hey, like when you were at the combine and Deion Sanders was there, it's like, I was pretty young. So I asked him, I was like, did you know? And he looked at me like I was crazy. He's like, oh, mate, we knew. He's like, talent like that, great, is easy to scout. It's good that lures you into thinking they're great. But he would say, as Al Davis used to say, he tilts the field, right? Like it was obvious. So it sounds like
Yeah.
a home run.
Well, if you continue the sports analogy, I mean, there are times when you launch a product and it feels like a well-struck ball, or like, and you just are like, yeah, that's right, that's going to work. And you, in the end, you can count those on your hands and toes probably that you experience that in your life. But when you hit one,
What about maybe a setback, something that didn't work out? Was there a valuable lesson that you learned maybe from, we could stick to products if you'd like, but maybe a flop that you learned a valuable lesson from?
oh gosh, I mean, there's been plenty of things that didn't go the way that that you want.
What about maybe something that you could apply to, like, hey, we learned this early in my career, but maybe we can like learn from that lesson at Filson. Has there been one of those moments yet?
Yes, when I joined the product team in Patagonia, the product offering just wasn't really connected to where the market opportunity was, and we needed to kind of bring those things together from a user perspective, from a retail market perspective. Um, I think with Filson, I think one of the beauties of this brand is it's taken its pedigree as kind of the original Alaskan outfitter very seriously. But what that means tangibly, if you go pick up some of our clothes, is they're like twice as heavy as anything else in the market. And so, I mean, there's forums online, and I remember reading this forum as I was coming on board, and a guy talks about having to rebuild his closet twice because it collapsed under the weight of all of his Filson product. And so those products are all terrific, and they all have their time and place in the portfolio, and you know, kind of horizontally across the United States, kind of north into Canada. I think the real opportunity for us in terms of bringing the product closer to market right now is how to interpret the brand for warmer weather environments, and warmer conditions, which we're all experiencing all the time. And I mean, I'm wearing a version of a jacket that is literally like the silhouette of our best-selling um, short line cruiser jacket, which was highlighted. I mean, the character Rip in Yellowstone wore it for like all 5 seasons, and like we didn't pay for it; it just showed up as part of the wardrobe for the crew. But this is a version of that same jacket that's about half the weight, and it means that you can just wear it a lot in a lot broader contexts and way more environments. And so I think a huge part of what we'll do as we tune the product line here is retain that kind of overbuilt, very serious, extremely warm and rugged product portfolio, but then also interpret that into, just like with a Nano Puff, into lighter and more wearable, year-round silhouettes.
That's interesting. Wow. Um, what would you say is the hardest part of your job?
Well, I like to say, like, running an apparel company is not rocket science, but it's not easy. It is. You would be surprised at the operational complexity of running an apparel business, and utilizing global supply chain and long lead times. I mean, we have materials that take 180 days to be ready to be sewn into garments, which means that you're buying really, really early. And so the operational complexity of running an apparel business is, that's a very broad statement, is the hardest part, when you maybe source from you know 20 vendors across 10 countries, with materials that take 90 to 180 days to be ready to sew, and then trying to marry those decisions you make in terms of the product portfolio and your purchasing behavior with demand on the market, right? And the demand picture has been really hard to read since COVID. Basically the entire COVID era and the post-COVID era, um, and now with tariffs on top of that, it really makes reading demand in the current environment tough.
Wow. Okay. Sounds like, yeah, it's almost like you got to be the weatherman, and it's really hard to be accurate 100% of the time, and you've got to play some bets. Um,
This is something I've probably grown into during my tenure as an executive in these businesses, but you know, probably the biggest distinguisher in an apparel company is its ability to forecast and plan its own production. Because apparel companies live or die by the amount of inventory that they own,
right.
and it is, inventory risk, especially long lead time inventory risk, is a real threat to businesses, and managing that well is the only way to survive in the apparel space.
There will be certain products like the one you're wearing that will always be there though, right? Like those sort of hero products that you don't have to worry about. You just need to make sure they're in stock, I imagine.
Yeah, if you're lucky, you have those as a business, right? And when you
Yeah.
have them, you rally around them and support them because you need those kind of anchors.
What have you found when you think about surrounding yourself with people you trust? Because oftentimes I'll talk to people in your position and everyone just kind of says yes around them. How have you found to really connect with people that'll tell you the truth?
Hmm. I think if you ever ask folks who report to me like what my style is like, they'll tell you I have a very flat sort of perspective on hierarchy. And I think this probably goes back to some of my own issues with authority as a kid. But I just will I will just want to treat people the way that I'd like to be treated, And I can also probably say that I've probably in every job I've been in felt like I had a better sense of what I ought to do than my boss does. And so I tend to trust those people in my organization who are subject matter experts. We will have a lot of dialogue back and forth, but um, having a sort of a non-hierarchical leadership style and really genuinely trusting and engaging with your subject matter experts is what I found to be the only way to do this. There's just these businesses are too complicated and you've got too many disciplines to be an expert in all of them. So
Mm-hmm.
you have to, build rapport with people who you can count on and then trust them.
That's awesome. That's interesting. Would you say there's one quality that if there, I'm sure there's many, but when you think about the values of the company, is there one thing that you try to hire for, whether it's like an executive at the company, somebody in the store, no matter the sort of role or title? What do you think is the most important quality for a new team member?
Well, I think authenticity is, people do ask me for, I guess career advice or want to have a dialogue around where they're headed and when they're interviewing or having conversations about their advancement in their own business. And the number one thing I always say to people is you got to just be yourself. You just need to be the best version of yourself and see if that's compatible with the opportunity. Because I've watched people, you know, you know corporate America being quite political and complicated, and people will twist and contort themselves to try to, comport to whatever they think is needed in their business. And I find, yeah, you should be mindful of how you show up at work, but mostly you should show up to work to be the best version of yourself. And if you do that, you're going to find yourself in the right spot, right? And so that's something I really encourage in my team. Just show up and be the best person of yourself, and that's kind of all we're trying to do with the business as well.
Yeah, I like that. If you do contort yourself, then down the line you'll be unhappy and it'll probably show, I imagine.
Yeah, for sure.
What is there one thing when you think about like self-care, is there one thing that you do to show up as the best version of yourself at home and both at work?
Well,
I
I,
imagine they
I
don't
wish
want
I,
you rock climbing anymore. Like,
yeah,
there must be
I,
something in your contract.
I'm what 4 or 5 months into this job, and so I'm totally
Yeah.
off my exercise routine right now. But I would say, for me, the foundation is exercise, food, sleep, and your primary relationship. In my case, it's with my wife, Sarah. Um, and you've got to be committed to those things in your life. And so I think people always kind of chuckle when they find out that I'm in bed at like between 8:30 and 9:15 every night. Right.
Really?
So
Wow.
yeah, because I'm up at like 4:30. And so the you know, having sleep as a foundation of your work life is I found to be super valuable. And through the course of my time as an executive, I've struggled with sleep in some cases dramatically. Um, and so it wasn't until maybe the last 5 years or so that I was able to really sort it out for myself. And it's been super helpful.
Was it because of like travel and time changes and things like that?
There's no doubt that I've been in the bad dad club for most of my adult life, like with the million mile, like a million mile airline
Yeah.
miles in any given time and multiple airlines. And one or two international trips a month and never knowing what time zone you're in when you get home.
That
Um,
definitely doesn't help sleep, right? Because your circadian rhythm is not where it needs to be.
yeah, so learning how to manage that
Yeah.
is really valuable, and I think we all start to develop tricks, for that type of travel when you do it a lot. But what I'm really talking about is more of just the, trying to get into a rhythm at home.
Yeah.
And when, COVID was, in some ways, COVID was great because we didn't have to travel. Everybody could actually get on a really deep circadian rhythm,
Yeah.
and you couldn't be forced to have to be in three time zones in one week. But those days are over now, so we're back at
Yeah.
it.
Is there one thing that you do in terms of a tip to wind down?
Well, I get home, I'll probably have a cocktail with my wife, joke around, put the kids to bed, and we take a super hot bath before bed. So like that temperature gradient,
Yeah.
that basically that cooling gradient is what helps drive you into deep sleep. Um, and over the summer, we're going to be building a sauna in our backyard so that we can do that in a little better style year round. So I think, when we lived in Europe, we got really into sauna culture and used it a lot, and have always wanted to have one. And, you know, so now we're doing that.
So that sauna sleep is the real thing. I've heard of that.
It's the real deal.
Okay. I have like a portable one on the way. It may not be as crazy, but it's like infrared. But I'm looking forward to it. I always look for any sleep hack that I can find.
Yeah, yeah, the infrared, you'll feel good in infrared sauna, but they just don't get as hot as you like. So I think if you've got a portable one to get started, you'll learn
Yeah.
and see what you like. Um, but getting the temperature high is, I think, super important.
Yeah. Who would you say has had the biggest impact on you in your career?
The first shop I worked in, the Alpine shop, the owners, Lisa and Holly, were a couple who owned a three-store chain. And I was an 18-year-old kid in college, and they made me a manager of the store. And I had an opportunity to learn the business from the inside. And, that break, that opportunity to work in kind of a really cool specialty ski bike climb store, um, at 18, 19 years old, um, was just the first and they recommended me for my first job at Patagonia because we were a big Patagonia retailer. And then, the
Oh,
job at
wow. That's
Patagonia
awesome.
sort of, grew from there.
That's awesome. I had a boss a long time ago. I remember we were interested in moving internationally, and he referred me to somebody. This is at BlackBerry. He referred me to some manager in Germany. And I was like, "What are you thinking? I don't even speak German. What am I going to
Yeah.
do?" Uh,
They all
and
speak English though, so you'll be okay.
do they? Okay. I was frightened when he mentioned that, but I always think
Yeah.
back like that's somebody who just always maybe believed in me more than I believed in myself. And looking back, like I just felt like we all need somebody like that.
Yeah. Multiple somebodies.
Yeah, totally. Is there, just thinking about like maybe books that have had a big impact on you, is there one or two that you recommend, business or nonfiction?
Books that have had a big impact on me. I mean, I do think Ryan Holiday's The Obstacle Is the Way is a really good one. You just like, uh, having gone through philosophy training and wound up as sort of a stoic on the far end of it, which they don't even teach you in university level philosophy, right? It's like not even part of the curriculum.
Oh, really? They
Um,
never talked about that when you were studying?
no,
Interesting. Okay.
no, it's sort of considered kind of like a practical application of philosophy. But and the university gets very esoteric in terms of the things that it's interested in, but it's really a philosophy of how to live a good life, and how to retain your composure and stay emotionally centered and be focused on the right stuff. So I'd say that's it. That's a good one.
Got I got one of his books on my desk.
There you go. Yeah,
Have you read that one?
I haven't. The Daily Dad. I
The
like it.
Daily Dad, yeah, 366 meditations on parenting, love, and raising great kids. And it's every day is like one page or so, maybe two
Yeah.
pages. So it's kind of a nice reminder, leave it on the desk, read a page in the morning, reflect
Do you
on it
start it
during the
at the
day.
beginning of the year and then try to do it, or did you just pick it up one day?
No, yeah, I just pick
Was
it
it a
up
New
like on
Year's?
the day that I'm in.
Uh-huh.
I think I've had it for, it's maybe like 2 years old now. Sometimes I
Okay.
forget about it, and then I'm like, it's
Yeah.
just one of those things when there's a few things that I try to like pick up, and as part of like a mini morning routine before I start my day.
Yeah.
somebody sent me the 50 laws of power. I'm not going to read that all in one day. So I'll try to like sneak in one law, in the morning.
Yeah.
Just it's more of like a history lesson because that might be like 5 or 10 pages of that law. So I just try to like chunk it, but it's been a good one. I really like that one. I like all of his books that I've read or listened to. I like because he reads most of his books. So I
Yeah.
like them on Audible. They're pretty good. Is there I mean, there's so many documentaries. I watched Free Solo and then it just got me watching these other ones. Is there a documentary or two? It doesn't have to be outdoors related, but I imagine you like some of those, but that you recommend people check out.
Uh, I don't watch a lot of TV. Free Solo is a great one, and Alex is exactly who shows up in that movie. He's an awesome human being. Um, you know what? I've been trying to get my wife to watch this, and she just will not take the time and sit down and watch it. But I watched it on a plane, and it just blew my mind. And it's a documentary about Coldplay, and it goes back to their origins of going to school, music school in London, and where they all met. And then it follows their trajectory from, just being a bunch of teenage boys like wanting to be rock stars, and then charts it forward. And I think the thing is that I appreciate about that documentary and kind of hearing their story and watching them evolve as musicians and as people and as a band, is that follow your bliss concept, because it's totally obvious that that's what they were doing, right? And they locked into it, at 18 or 19 years old, and then just kept going.
That's awesome. I mean, I hear both. Some people say like, don't follow your passion. That's dangerous advice. And then you hear obviously follow your passion. But I imagine
Yeah,
there's
Scott
justification.
Galloway can give me a lecture on it about don't follow your passion, but that's a terrible idea. It might be a terrible idea. I've done the opposite of that, and it's worked out.
Yeah. I like a lot of his stuff. And some of it, yeah, I have to question and pause because not obviously not, not everything is for everybody.
Yeah,
Fast forward 20 years from now, what do you hope your kids say about you as a dad?
he loved me. I think the there's some level of confidence that kids get from having like a presence of love in their lives that's sort of deep and non-conditional. And there's that. And my wife and I have been taking our sons camping since they were infants. And I'd like for them to have memories of going camping with mom and dad when we were kids.
Yeah, that's awesome. If you were talking to someone early on in their career, they want to make an impact in this world, what are 2 to 3 general pieces of life/career advice that you would impart on them?
Go to the office.
That's
like
great
like
advice. Yeah.
I mean, literally, I mean, I all of the job opportunities I have are from working with people who are older than me and senior to me in organizations who said you should go do this thing. You'll never develop those relationships with people if you don't spend time with them. So you got to go to the office. You got to spend time with your bosses and peers. Um, you know, be the best version of yourself. There are so many different ways to make a living and so many different types of functions and mindsets that are required for different, front end, back end, product, creative operations. um, Try to be the best version of yourself and authentically. um, and then I guess the last one is that be very careful in terms of who you choose to be your primary relationship in life, because it's the most important relationship in your life. And having a solid footing there is I think a precondition for everything else.
This is great. I really appreciate you just leaning into it. I thought like there's so much that people can learn from you.
Well, it was really nice to meet you.
Likewise. Likewise. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim.
All right,
Appreciate it. All
take
right. Have
care.
a good one. Bye.
Bye.